sinners, and saints. Dust off those horns and halos. It's time for Alan After Dark.
The calendar says the year is 2025, but I have to wonder, maybe it's actually 1935. Doesn't it seem like we're going backwards? That civilization, our society, is reverting back to the fascistic times of the 1930s and 40s? It just feels that way to me. Whether or not it does to you, sinners and saints, I'll leave it up to you. If you listened to last week's episode of Alan After Dark, you all know that I had a pretty bad case of COVID. It was my second infection, and yes, I am vaccinated, and yes, I am well aware that vaccinations help reduce the dangerous effects of an illness, not prevent them. I thought, as I've been recovering, that I wanted to talk about conspiracy theories. I know you all have heard all the conspiracy theories around COVID and the lab in Wuhan, China, and all the other random conspiracies involving the vaccine. So I wanted to go back and look at some of the conspiracy theories throughout the last century and explain why some conspiracy theories actually had more merit than others. I think we can start with a 1927 ruling in the case of Buck versus Bell, in which the Supreme Court ruled by an 8-1 vote that states had the right to implement mandatory sterilization. The ruling is considered one of the worst decisions ever made by the U.S. Supreme Court, which probably for most of us would be an understatement. But when you look at the underlying case, I think you could be even more horrified. The case involved Carrie Buck, who had been raped and was impregnated by a relative, a nephew of the foster family that she was entrusted to. Her foster family, they were afraid of it being exposed, and they didn't want any more shame put on the family, so they had her committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, basically claiming that she was mentally disabled. After she gave birth to the child, the officials at that institution deemed her a candidate for mandatory sterilization, which she underwent. She was indeed sterilized, and even though she had a lawyer, the lawyer was a friend of the hospital. I use that word loosely. And they really did conspire to make sure that the Supreme Court would uphold the right for a state to dictate who could and could not procreate. The ruling was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, and I'm pretty sure most people have heard that name. He was on the Supreme Court at the turn of the century, way back then, who apparently believed in eugenics. The argument was that people of a feeble mind should not be allowed to reproduce because it weakened the human race as a whole, but they meant, in particular, the white race. But what that ruling did was give states, I think, a broad range to decide what a feeble-minded person was. When you look at the 70,000 plus people that were forcibly sterilized by state governments, it wasn't just mentally disabled people, it was blind people, deaf people. Some would argue even people of color. And let's not forget, gay people. That the state itself had the authority, as of 1927's Supreme Court ruling, to forcibly sterilize any citizen it deemed unworthy of generating a normal human. I guess they get to decide what normal was too. But if you look at that first ruling and the foundation it laid for government control of procreation, it's not hard to believe that some of these conspiracy theories might have some merit. We'll go from 1927 to 1932 and the Tuskegee syphilis studies. It was supposed to be a truly scientific study that monitored people who were infected with syphilis and the consequences of treatments and non-treatments, like most studies would be conducted. It was focusing primarily on black men. The problem is they took healthy black men who did not have syphilis and they infected them with syphilis under the guise that they were being treated for other conditions. And they were never told that they had been purposely infected with syphilis. Just look up the damage that syphilis can do to the human body. I mean, a lot of times it's fatal, I believe. Or it was back in the day. And if you are an African American male, you have every reason to be suspect of government intentions. All these instances back in the early turn of the 20th century really does reinforce those fears of what an unchecked government could do. Interestingly enough, there really became a distaste for forced sterilization after what was witnessed in the 1930s and 40s with Nazi Germany and Hitler and his agenda. He was taking the same theories of eugenics, but he was applying it not only to mentally disabled people, gay people, physically disabled people, but to Jews and gypsies. Anybody he deemed as of a lesser value to humanity, which was his arbitrary decision. They would apply not only sterilization, but extermination. And I guess when those who supported forcible sterilization in the United States had that mirror held up to their own face, they realized how bad it really was and really couldn't stomach it. Even though technically Buck versus Bell has never been overturned by the Supreme Court, it technically is still on the books, although there have been other rulings about the right to procreation that would have to be decided by a right-wing Supreme Court today that probably wouldn't do anything. With the Roe versus Wade ruling, they basically have said that every state has the right to do whatever they want. If it's a law on the books, then what would stop Virginia, Oklahoma, Alabama in particular, from attempting to do this again? Would a Supreme Court of today stop forcible sterilizations? I have my doubts, and I think a lot of you do too, and that lays that groundwork for conspiracy theories. I know a lot of people might be asking, well, why? Why would the government go this route? Why would they go to such lengths? Well, if you are a believer in eugenics and these theories that the human race could be, quote unquote, improved, they're using the basic argument that we use for immunizations. You know, immunizations, herd immunity for things like polio and measles really did work for the greater good of everyone. But if you get it in your mind that you could actually eliminate certain disabilities, you could eliminate certain cancers just by controlling who is able to give birth, it's really unfortunate that these people take such a simplistic view of genetics and diseases. If they really understood the science, the biology of the human species, they would understand that even if you did such things as try to breed out certain diseases, that there's always going to be genetic anomalies somewhere that someone didn't pick up. They will always pop back up into our human race, regardless of the efforts that you put into doing such things as eliminating cancer through controlling procreation. Unfortunately, some of these messed up brains don't see a problem with that. And it's those type of people that we're seeing even now, possibly getting into positions of power that will not only fuel conspiracy theories in their favor, but they'll generate others as well. But which ones could possibly be true? It's a two-edged sword, is it not? Let's fast forward to the 70s and the 80s. There was a real explosion in drug addiction and drug abuse particularly in the early 80s with crack cocaine. And it just seemed like crack cocaine came out of nowhere and had infiltrated the inner cities of every major city in the U.S. and I'm sure around the world. And it seemed to be particularly devastating to the black community. And there had been whispers, I'd even heard of them as a child, that the CIA had been involved in manufacturing and introducing these drugs for the sole purpose of wiping out the African American community in the United States. When you started looking at how the epidemic of drug addiction with crack cocaine evolved, it was a cheap substitute for cocaine. It was much more addictive, apparently. It was just easier to get than other forms of drugs. It felt like it really was geared toward targeting poorer people and then wiping them out, because a lot of right-wing governments around the world look at the poor, the needy, the disabled as a drain, a drag on the economy of the country. If you didn't have those types of people, they believe that the world is better, even though they will argue out of the other side of their mouth that all life is precious and should be valued. I've yet to figure out how they reconcile that, other than they will demonize groups so that society as a whole is afraid of them. It's not hard to buy into the conspiracy theory that the CIA could have been involved with drug cartels in Latin America to introduce this drug to wipe out a certain segment of people when you go back to the Tuskegee syphilis studies, the Buck versus Bell ruling, that there really was an organized government level conspiracy to eliminate certain types of people. Don't y'all forget, I'm talking about a time before social media. So you didn't have this rapid fire of misinformation flying across the internet where people could spread it like a wildfire. This is a time when it was word of mouth. There was no Fox News. You had the network news and you had print media that really was the driver of these stories. And they really did try to avoid presenting false information, unlike what we have today with social media, with Fox News. That's nothing more than propaganda. So in discussing these older conspiracy theories, you have to remember one simple fact, that information traveled at a much slower rate than it does now, which leads me to talk about the conspiracy theories that affected me and our community the most. In the early 80s, when AIDS was a disease that didn't really have a name, most of the people that were infected didn't know that they were and didn't even know how. As science and medicine struggled to catch up and understand what we were dealing with, they initially called the disease GRIDS, gay-related immune deficiency syndrome, but quickly understood that would cause a stigma that would make people believe that only gay people could get it. And obviously, there's no disease that singles out sexual orientation. We are all Homo sapien, and that's how the diseases that affect us work. There is no moral compass that decides who gets what disease, and we'll get into that in a little while. Finally, when the virus was isolated and they could name it, and you began to understand the dialect of HIV and acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, you saw politically in this country, the United States, the right wing and religious people were going to use the disease to say that it was God that was striking down gay men for their behavior, even though hemophiliacs were infected, heterosexual people were infected, IV drug users were infected. They had their own agenda to spread their theory that if people would change their ways, especially gay men, the disease would go away, that God wouldn't punish others for what gay men were doing. But there was that fear of the unknown, especially the years when it really didn't even have a name and it wasn't gaining headlines. People were not aware that this disease was growing, in particular within the gay community. Let's go back to the 1970s, the Nixon era. Now, you all know about Watergate and how Nixon was obsessed with control and understanding what the other side might have as far as information on him or his family, anything that could be used against him. But that spread beyond just his personal domestic agenda in a lot of ways. He really did want to strengthen the CIA, the FBI, to the power it had in its heyday. Under his administration, the military complex became more and more involved in bioweapons. It doesn't really make a lot of headlines, but that's where the first conspiracy theories begin. Because the HIV virus is so hard to understand because of its complexity, the argument is that it must have been created in some of the United States bioweapons labs, that they perfected a virus that could target certain communities and wipe them out without people being wise to the fact that it was an American weapon that had been created to do just that. But when the virus became out of control, there was no cure, there was no treatment, even though in theory, when it was introduced into the gay community, it was a community that the powers that be, wanted rid of. And as far as the conspiracy theory goes, these people that were behind the creation of the HIV virus, they're so stupid to think that the virus would only affect gay men who had gay sex. It falls under the same category of the previous conspiracy theories involving eugenics. Gay men bring nothing to the table to advance the human race, so it's okay to wipe them out. And they would use the umbrella of God punishing people for their sins to sort of justify it. The Nixon bioweapons theory carries on under the Reagan administration, which had no desire to help the gay community to fight this virus in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I don't think Reagan even used the word AIDS until like the 7th year of his administration. And the Surgeon General took years to even talk about safe sex using condoms, even though the evidence was showing that the virus was spreading in so many different communities that they needed to do something to curb the spread. But in their prejudiced minds, they still believed that it was just gay men, so it was okay. So if you were in the gay community, where were you getting your information from that you needed? You had Gay Men's Health Crisis, you had the American Foundation for AIDS Research, you had Hollywood, in particular female celebrities who were out there raising money, raising awareness, trying to get people to pay attention. And it was understood quickly that with a Republican administration and people like Jesse Helms and Jerry Falwell interfering, it was going to take private funding to begin the research on treatment for HIV/AIDS, which is what happened. People like Elton John and Madonna, Elizabeth Taylor worked to raise money to fight this disease, to fund the research, to try to stop it. When you were a young gay man, and me being one of them, I was terrified of AIDS and HIV. It was our version of a scarlet letter. If you were diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, you were going to be ostracized by society, by even your own family. It gave them a justification to be afraid of you even more than just being gay. It was definitely a curse, but not for the reason why the right wing and religious groups were saying. But when you're beaten down like that as a gay man, is it that hard to believe that perhaps an American bioweapons lab in Africa had created this virus for the sole purpose of introducing it to certain communities in order to wipe them out? We have evidence even from the Supreme Court in 1927 with Buck versus Bell. We have the Tuskegee syphilis studies. We have tangible evidence that could lead you to believe that since your government hates you anyway, and with the backing of religious groups, why wouldn't they do such a thing? I think a lot of us read Stephen King's The Stand, and it kind of fell into that category where, well, yeah, we don't have much doubt that the U.S. in the 70s and early 80s engaged in bioweapons research. It's not that hard to believe that they would do such a thing for the sole purpose of wiping us out, but then not understanding that you can't just control a virus, a disease, because it does flourish within an entire species. Gay men aren't a separate species. We're all still Homo sapien. I guess I need to say that several times to make that kind of be absorbed by people as a whole, communities as a whole. We're not different. We're all the same species, and the diseases will spread one way or the other. They always seem to find a way. So the best course is to try to find and implement a cure, which leads to probably the ultimate in conspiracy theories, but it's the one that I find the hardest to knock down. For many years, and at my happy hour discussions, we've talked about why isn't there a cure to AIDS? Why isn't there a cure for cancer, for diabetes, for lots of chronic illnesses and fatal illnesses? Well, the theory immediately comes up that pharmaceutical companies make too much damn money for treatment that they have no incentive to provide a cure, that there are cures for AIDS and cancer, but they just don't want to reveal them because they lose all this money for the medical treatments. And in a country like the United States, where everything is driven by profit, it really is kind of hard, isn't it, to say, they would never do that. But everything is driven by profit. So how do you knock that conspiracy theory down? The only way that I could is that I hope that there are scientists that have a conscience, that want to do what's good for humanity, not what's good for the bottom line of a pharmaceutical company. But if we continue following the path to profit, I don't see how you could ever dismiss that conspiracy theory. I know y'all want to know, what do I believe when it comes to HIV/AIDS? Well, I honestly believe from everything that I've read that the virus evolved in Africa probably in the 1930s from people who ate raw monkey meat. And it took that long for it to evolve into what happened in the late 70s through the 80s until now. I do remember the information that came out when they tried to track down quote unquote patient zero, and it seemed to be a male flight attendant that had a lot of international travel that probably spread it initially to multiple countries, including the United States. To me, nature is a much more effective and vicious killer than a lab-grown virus. And I always feel that, like even with COVID-19, nature is always sending up trial balloons. And it's like, okay, that one was pretty effective, but we can make it even stronger. that the next coronavirus will be much more brutal when it finally does evolve. I guess I really am a firm believer in the theory of Occam's razor, that all things being equal, the simplest answer is usually the right one. So when it comes to conspiracy theories, I'm still going to hedge on the side of science and information versus someone posting on Twitter or Blue Sky or Threads some outlandish theory that they say they got from someone who worked at Area 51 or in the Pentagon or CIA. Truth will always will out. Thank you for joining me for the beginning of what could be 4 of the suckiest years that have ever sucked. I hope you've been informed, challenged, and entertained with this episode of Allen After Dark. If not, stay tuned. It's going to be one hell of a wild ride this year. Remember, take life by the balls and be real. We'll see you soon.